In the summer of 1947, a small group of men gathered in Washington with a shared interest in a piece of legislation that most Americans would never read. They were not elected officials. They were not generals. They were, by and large, lawyers, bankers, and former intelligence officers who had spent the Second World War learning something extraordinarily valuable. That information, when properly controlled, was more powerful than any weapon. And when the National Security Act landed on Harry Truman's desk that July, what those men were actually signing off on was not a defensive measure against Soviet aggression. It was something closer to a corporate charter. That is documented fact, not theory. And if you stay with me through what follows, I think it will permanently change how you understand one of the most powerful institutions in American history. The story you were taught goes something like this. The Soviet Union emerged from the Second World War as an expansionist nuclear power. America, blindsided by the attack on Pearl Harbor and alarmed by Soviet missions in Europe, desperately needed a centralized intelligence service to prevent another catastrophic failure of warning. The CIA was the answer. It was born from necessity, forged in the fires of geopolitical fear, and dedicated from the start to the protection of democratic values against communist tyranny. That story is not entirely wrong, but it is, in the most important ways, incomplete, and the parts that were left out deliberately. To understand what the CIA actually was at the moment of its creation, you have to understand what came before it. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was America's wartime intelligence organization. Its founder and director, William Donovan, was a Wall Street lawyer. His recruits came disproportionately from Ivy League universities, from old money families. Yale alone supplied so many officers to the OSS that the organization was sometimes referred to inside the agency as the Department of Yale. These were men who spoke European languages because they had studied in Europe, who had contacts in foreign governments because their firms had done business with those governments. The OSS was disbanded in September 1945 by Truman's executive order, and that itself a story worth pausing on, because Truman did not shut the OSS because it had failed. He shut it because he was genuinely suspicious of a permanent peacetime intelligence service with secret funding and no public accountability. He called the idea of such an agency, and this is documented in his own private correspondence, something that smelled like the Gestapo. The man who would eventually sign the CIA into existence was, at the moment of the OSS dissolution, actively hostile to the concept. That reversal tells you almost everything. If Truman was opposed to a centralized secret service, and if the Soviet threat, while real, was not yet the existential emergency it would later become in the public imagination, then who exactly was pushing for the CIA, and what did they need it for? While Washington was debating the shape of post-war intelligence, the men who had built the wartime OSS were not sitting idle. Donovan himself was actively lobbying, producing memos, commissioning studies. His vision for a post-war intelligence service was specific and striking. He wanted an agency that would operate with a classified budget answerable to the executive branch alone, with the authority to conduct covert operations globally. His 1944 memo to Franklin Roosevelt outlining this vision was leaked to the press and caused a minor scandal precisely because it read, to contemporary observers, like a blueprint for an American secret police force. The pushback was immediate and fierce. And yet, 3 years later, the institution Donovan described was essentially what Congress created. The names changed. The stated mission changed. The underlying architecture did not. By 1947, the Soviet threat was not imaginary. Soviet intelligence services were actively operating in the United States. The Venona Project was revealing the extraordinary depth of Soviet penetration into American institutions. The fall of Eastern Europe to Soviet-aligned governments was not a hypothetical. The deterioration of the wartime alliance was real, documented, and alarming to anyone paying attention. But here is where the Steelman ends. because the existence of a genuine threat does not tell you why the response to that threat took the specific institutional form it did. It does not explain why the CIA was given a classified budget, the only agency in the federal government whose exact funding is constitutionally concealed from the public. It does not explain why the National Security Act built in explicit authorization for the agency to perform functions and duties beyond intelligence collection. Its phrase so deliberately vague that it is being used to justify everything from propaganda campaigns to assassinations to the overthrow of foreign governments. The Soviet threat explains the urgency. It does not explain the architecture. And the architecture is where the money is. The founding of the CIA was underwritten at the level of personnel and institutional design by a remarkably coherent social network. The first director of Central Intelligence, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, was largely sidelined. Frank Wisner, who would build the Office of Policy Coordination, the covert operations arm, was a Wall Street lawyer who had worked for Carter Ledyard and Milburn, one of the oldest firms in New York. Alan Dulles, who would become the agency's longest-serving director, was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, the firm whose client list included Standard Oil, United Fruit, and Goldman Sachs. His brother John Foster Dulles was simultaneously shaping American foreign policy as Secretary of State. The concentration of power in a single family, with roots in a single law firm, is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented public record. Sullivan and Cromwell's clients had significant interests in the precise regions of the world where the CIA would conduct its most consequential early covert operations. United Fruit Company had extensive holdings in Guatemala. The CIA-backed coup that overthrew Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 came directly after Arbenz began a land reform program that would have redistributed unused United Fruit land to Guatemalan peasants. The land in question was valued at approximately $1.2 million by United Fruit's own accounting. When the Guatemalan government offered that same figure as compensation, United Fruit suddenly claimed the land was worth $25 million. Alan Dulles, the CIA director who authorized the coup, had previously served on United Fruit's board. His predecessor as director, Walter Bedell Smith, joined United Fruit's board immediately after leaving the agency. The revolving door was not spinning. It was bolted open. The historians who have documented this most carefully, scholars like Tim Weiner, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning history of the CIA was built on thousands of declassified documents, are not fringe figures. They are mainstream academic historians working from primary sources. The picture they paint is unsettling, precisely because it is so well documented. Within the CIA itself, almost from the beginning, there were officers who understood exactly what the institution was becoming, and were troubled by it. More revealing is the case of the agency's own Inspector General reports from the 1950s and early 1960s, which documented the degree to which covert operations were being run not in the service of national security assessments, but in response to economic and political pressures from outside the government. These reports show CIA officers asking in internal memos whether specific operations had been authorized on the basis of intelligence analysis or on the basis of relationships between senior officials and private economic interests. The episode that most clearly revealed the CIA's true operational logic in its first decade was the 1953 coup in Iran, known as Operation Ajax. Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. British intelligence approached the CIA with a request for joint covert action to remove him. The Eisenhower administration authorized it. The CIA's Kermit Roosevelt Jr. ran the operation on the ground in Tehran, paying street gangs and political figures to create the appearance of popular opposition to Mossadegh. The CIA engineered a military coup that restored Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. The beneficiary was not the American people. The beneficiary was a British oil company. A democratic government was destroyed for oil revenue. The CIA was the instrument. The logic was financial, not ideological. What becomes clear when you look at the pattern is that the covert operations culture of the early CIA was not an aberration produced by a few bad actors. It was the predictable output of a system structurally designed to serve certain interests. The men who built the CIA came from a world where the distinction between corporate interest and national interest was essentially non-existent, where what was good for American business abroad was, by definition, good for America. The sociologist C. Wright Mills described this cohort in his 1956 book, The Power Elite, as men who moved seamlessly between positions in corporate boardrooms, law firms, and government agencies, sharing a coherent worldview about America's proper role in the global economy. The revolving door between Sullivan and Cromwell, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Directorship of Central Intelligence was not an accident of personnel. It was the organizational expression of a class. The National Security Agency, created in 1952 by a classified presidential directive not even publicly acknowledged for years, operated on the same model. Each new institution added another layer of unaccountable authority. The United States intelligence community today operates on a combined classified budget that exceeds $90 billion annually, appropriated through a process that discloses only the aggregate figure, not by agency, not by program, not by operation. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. The $90 billion budget did not shrink. It grew. If the CIA was truly built to counter Soviet intelligence, then why, more than 3 decades after that threat dissolved, does every single structural feature of the original design remain exactly in place? Why is the budget still classified? Why is the covert authorities still as broad as it was when Wisner wrote it? Why does the revolving door between the agency and the private firm profit from its contracts still spin as freely as it did when Allen Dulles walked through it? Maybe the answer is that the Soviet threat was simply replaced by new threats, and the institution adapted in good faith. That is the conventional answer, and there is some truth in it. Or maybe the institution that was built in 1947 is still exactly what it was designed to be. Not a shield against foreign enemies, but a mechanism for ensuring that a certain kind of economic power can operate in the world without the inconvenience of democratic accountability. And maybe the reason that answer is so difficult to sit with is not because it is paranoid, but because the documented record makes it so very hard to dismiss.